Hi, Learning Coaches. This is Jenny Baldwin, and I am the Elementary Math Instructional Coach. And today we're going to talk about the Math Plus Yellow curriculum and Unit 5, Decimals, Addition, and Subtraction. And you will notice that, yes, we have skipped a few units right here at the beginning of the OLS, and we're moving to decimals. And we would have done this earlier in the year, but since the curriculum is being sent out a few months at a time, we are just now able to do this, and we feel like this is going to be a much better learning opportunity for your student that will correlate a little bit better with what we have going on in Class Connect sessions. Right now in Class Connects, we are continuing our discussion of place value, and we are talking this upcoming week about decimals, especially comparing them and rounding them. And this past week we did talk about powers of 10 and exponents, and we have just been learning those basics of place value. And you may wonder, why are the classes not aligned exactly with the OLS? Well, there's so much importance and value to understanding decimals and place value to the extent that we want you to have. There was just not enough lessons in Unit 1 to cover that. So we want to make sure that your student is successful with all of those skills, because those skills are also used in multiplication and division of whole numbers, and multiplication and division and addition, subtraction of decimals. So we are building that strong foundation for future success. Now when you look at this unit, again, it starts off with just the basics of decimals, but then it moves into computing with decimals. The lesson checkpoints are things that you can always check out before you teach the lesson to your child to make sure that you are covering things thoroughly. But definitely go through the lesson components. There's lots of things to choose from that are both online and offline. So let's go ahead and we're going to head to the Student Lesson Activity Guide and the Learning Coach Guide. This is the Learning Coach Guide, and remember, the tab on the side will be closed and you have to open it up. And I highly recommend that you simply, when you go to the Learning Coach Guide, open up that table of contents and really look at the lesson that is being covered. So right now we're in decimal, addition, and subtraction. The very first lesson is compare decimals. So if you click on compare decimals, you're going to go right to that page. And the same thing in the student guide. Now in the Learning Coach Guide, it's going to be page 193. Now if we head over to the Student Activity Guide and we go to compare decimals, the page number is going to be different. It's only 64. So don't assume that the pages are always going to align. And because the Learning Coach Guide definitely gives more tips and clues for you as a learning coach on how to help your child be successful. So as we look at the Learning Coach Guide, we can see that the first lesson is on comparing decimals. Before we even go any further about comparing decimals, I want to talk to you a little bit with my document camera about what a decimal even means and how important it is for us to continue those conversations of basic place value. Now, right here I have some digiblocks. This block right here represents 100. Now inside, and the teachers have these and they're going to be using these, and you may have already seen them in Class Connects. So inside this box is 100 individual blocks. It was stuck. So we have right here groups, and inside I have 10 of these. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 of these, and inside each 10 of these are 10 individual cubes. So these are like our base 10 blocks, but they're called digiblocks. The reason we like these is because they can be taken apart and moved. So a 10 is made up of 10 ones. 10 groups of 10 makes 100. So I know that students have been taught that for a long time and they may have that concept down pat. But then when we start thinking about this whole number 1, or any whole number, but we'll just focus on 1. What if we had to divide this 1 into pieces? And what we need to think about continue to think about that discussion that place value is based on tens. So here's my 1 whole, and if I divide it up into 10 pieces, I'm going to have tenths, because 10 of these make a whole. So right here, you can see that, 1/10 is definitely not the same as one whole. It's much smaller, and it would take 10 of these to make a whole. Now, when we take our 1/10 and we say, well, what if I needed to divide this up and I needed to chop it into equal pieces? Well, then we get hundredths. So I'm going to write my hundredths right here. And it's always important for students to remember that once we get to the decimals, we add that th, and then I kept on going, we would have thousandths. And this decimal, when we get to this, we always say the word and. So I have 1 and let's take one of these away. 1 and 11 hundredths, and whatever we end with is what word we say. So it's important as you work with decimals to continue using that vocabulary and talking about the decimals. But again, 10 hundredths make a tenth, 10 tenths make a whole. So right now, if I was going to represent a picture, I could say that I have, and let's put our little decimal, because here's our wholes and here's our part of the whole. Decimals are the same things as fractions. They're part of a whole. So we have 3 and 43 hundredths. So again, it's important for students to really think about the place value system and how each digit, let's have a 333, just like we have here, a 111. As we move up, the number or the digit gets 10 times larger. As we move down, the digit gets 10 times smaller. So we go this way, we divide by tenths. If we did 2 hops, we would divide by hundredths. And here we have this 3 and this 3. So if I wanted to compare how much larger the 3 and the ones is to the 3 and the hundredths, I know that it is 2 hops away, so it'd be times 10 times 10. This 3 is 100 times bigger than this 3 because we are based on tens. So let's go ahead and head back to the student guide, and let's take a peek at comparing numbers. Now, when you compare decimals, it's just like comparing whole numbers. You have to think about the place of each digit. What I always like to do, and especially when numbers are written in a row, I like to line them up one on top of each other. So in their math journals, when they see numbers like this and it says use the comparison symbols of greater than or less than or equal to, have them write them on top of each other. And again, I'm going to get out my document camera because I think this is so important to model as we teach. So let me get my little manipulatives ready and turn on my document camera. Here I have some place value flip charts. Now again, you could make something like this just with number tiles, put digits. You could have go all the way up to millions if you wanted to. But like I said, when we compare to figure out which one is larger, it's important to place them above each other. And you could even have 3 or 4 that you're placing against each other. In one of my first recordings, I talked about how fun it is to even have a decimal challenge game with a deck of cards. So you could play a game and say, okay, we have a 9, where are you going to put your 9? And then at the end, see who has the largest number. Now when we look at these, if they were side by side, it would be a little bit harder to compare which is bigger. But if I put them like this and I line up the place values, I see that I have 9 wholes or 9 ones. I have 4 tenths, so that's the same. Here I have 3 hundredths and 4 hundredths. And then here I have 7 thousandths and 9 thousandths. Sometimes students automatically say, oh, well, this one's bigger because it has a 9, so this has to be bigger. But you think about those digiblocks and how small the pieces got. We started with our whole and then got 10 times smaller and 10 times smaller and 10 times smaller. This digit doesn't matter. If this digit is smaller, if we have only 3 hundredths compared to 4 hundredths, we know that this number is going to be larger. And it also doesn't matter how many digits you have. So let's look at another example with some other manipulatives. Right here, I have a couple of numbers. Let's compare 361 thousandths to 51 hundredths. Now, a lot of students think, oh, well, this number right here has to be larger because it has more digits. But if you compare the value of the digits, you can see that that's not necessarily true. Here we have 3/10 and 5/10. We don't even have to worry about these other ones. 5/10 is much bigger than 3/10. We can see that with our manipulatives. We know that here we have 5, and if we had 3, it's much bigger. So we don't even have to worry about the hundredths and the thousandths. So also just continue to keep that in mind as you work with your students. I'm going to get out one more manipulative. Okay, so now I have our models here of the a number 222 thousandths, but I have it layered like this so we could break it apart into its different place value. We can see we have 2/10, 200ths, 2,000ths. This 2 increased by 10 or decreased by 1/10 as we went down. So again, there's arrow cards that I will put in the newsletter as well that you can help build these numbers and show how the value changes. They're great for comparing the digits and taking things apart and really being hands-on. And also what I wanted to point out too is that especially when you're comparing numbers, things can be the same. Even though it's longer, these zeros represent that we have no hundredths and no thousandths. So actually, even though this is 4/10 and this is 400 thousandths, they are the same amount. So again, using these models, using cards, using manipulatives is what's going to help make math make sense. You could again represent this with a 4 and a 4 by cutting things apart, and I'll show you some other blocks in just a second that you can use with grid paper to show how these are the same even though they may look very different. So let's head back to the OLS and see what's after comparing decimals. We are going to get into expanding. You can see compare and expand decimals, and that is where it gets a little tricky for students sometimes because the terminology is just a little bit different. Again, I would print out place value charts and use some of these same models that they're using in the OLS, and I would have your child write these in their math journal. They may be familiar with expanded form, but they may not be familiar with writing expanded form like this, and they will see this in Study Island, and they're likely to see this on the end of the year assessment. So right here we have 348 and 29 hundredths. The 3 is in the hundreds and has a value of 300, so we multiply 3 100 times 100. So that takes care of that one digit. Sometimes you might even see parentheses around that. But make sure that your student understands the difference between the multiplication and the addition sign. So we have 3 hundredths. Now we're going to add that to the next value. We have 4 in the tens, so we have 4 times 10. Then we're going to add that to the ones. We have 8. We only have it one time because it's in the ones. It has a value of 1 or 8. Now we're going to add that to our decimal values. So we have 2 in the tenths. And remember, a tenth is just part of a whole. So we only have 2 tenths or 2 of the 10 pieces. And then we're going to add that to the next digit, which is a 9 in the hundredths. So we're going to multiply 9 times 100th. So that is how you write a decimal in expanded form. Now, as we continue to move through, again, it's going to get some larger numbers, even going up to thousandths. And then we're going to talk about what we've already shown you with the manipulatives is the ordering decimals. And again, I would use those cards, use tiles, because when they're written in strange orders, it's sometimes hard to see them unless you really think about the value of each digit. Sometimes it can be tricky. But again, things like this that help them be problem solvers. So if this is the greatest number and this is the least, what's something in between? And helping them think, well, it could be 4.99 or it could be 5.23. In any of those, there's lots of different choices. They do give some options, but it's important to ask those questions in real world examples because then they're going to see decimals everywhere they go. And we'll talk about that and how to talk about decimals when you go shopping as well. So again, there's lots of practice on ordering decimals and making sure that even when it's tricky, they don't get tricked. They think about the value of each digit. Now, after we go through the ordering of decimals, we're going to round decimals. Fourth grade did talk a lot about rounding whole numbers, and what we want to do is move on to rounding decimals. And it's important to think about even using money with your students and thinking about, okay, if I have $5.25, what's the nearest dollar? Would it be 5 or 6? And so students can use coins and nickels and dimes and pennies to think about how to round to the nearest whole number. So here, we're not necessarily rounding to the whole number, we're rounding to the hundredth. The same rules apply as we did with whole numbers. We want students to think about those models and those visuals. And there are also lots of LearnZillion videos and resources that I'll share as well through the newsletter that helps you understand how to use this with models and how to use this with number lines. So we were rounding this number to the nearest hundredth. We would think about that 8 and then look at the next number because that's going to help us determine if it's below the midpoint or above the midpoint. Now I am going to get out a couple of additional materials to show with my webcam while we're on this topic. And so let me turn that on to show you a few fun things that you can do at home. This is a game that a lot of the 5th grade teachers have that you might see at an outing. And it's just kind of fun, but again, you can make a spinner out of a paper plate. You can also put a paper clip and a pencil and just write numbers in all the different sections. So you could do something similar to this and make your own game. So we have a huge number here. And again, it's so important for kids to see numbers and say the numbers. So we have 8,209,761 and 27 hundredths. Now I'm going to figure out what place I need to round it to, and I get to the 10,000s. So again, here's the 10,000s, it's a 0. If I had said tenths, the same rules would apply. I would look at that tenths and look to the number next door and determine if it is above or below the midpoint. Now I'm going to show you a little bit something else, what I mean about the midpoint. Using a number line, even with decimals, is a great thing. This number line shows 0 to 1. So you could create this in a math journal and show these numbers 0 to 1 and divide the number line into 10 sections. We have 1/10 all the way to 9/10. And then when we get to that 10th, we trade and regroup and have a whole, just like we do with our tens, ones, and hundreds. We do the same thing with hundredths and tenths and ones. We regroup and create a new group. So what we're going to do is think about, here is the midpoint, right in between a 0 and 1/10. So the midpoint would be only like 5 hundredths. So let's look right here at these little cards. And this is what you can make at home, and I'll show you how you can make these. And you can create number lines. Now I know that a whole tenth is going to look something like this because I have 1 whole tenth. I know that this number is this is half. This would go halfway, or it would be 5 hundredths. So I want it to be less than that. So now I have 2 hundredths. And here is my tenth. So you can see how we can gradually begin to show students how to conceptualize what a decimal really means. We still don't have a whole. We're still down here close to 0. So when we get to this midpoint, the 5 in the middle, anything about this 5 or above would round up. Anything here would round down. So let's look at a few more. Let's look right here. We have 6 tenths. We have a number that's in between 6 tenths and 7 tenths. So let me look at my cards. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it is in between 6 and 7 tenths. It looks like it's right halfway between, and that would be true. We have 6 tenths or 65 hundredths, because we have 6 whole tenths and 5 hundredths, so we have 65 hundredths. And we would write that like this: 65 hundredths. This would be written as 2 hundredths. This would be written as 1/10, or we could say 10 hundredths. So again, things like this are going to make math meaningful and fun and engaging. So encourage your child to get out those manipulatives and color in some frames. I'm going to show you right now how to find those frames or grids. If you look in the resource section of your lesson guide, you will see these cutouts, and it's just grid paper, so you could easily cut these out and shade all the way from 1 to 100 and make pieces that students can compare decimals with, round decimals with, and group decimals. So let's go on back to the OLS and to the activity book again. And after students round decimals, we are going to get into computing with decimals. Now, 4th grade students really began to add and subtract using the standard algorithm, which is, lining up the digits and regrouping. We definitely don't want to have students just follow a procedure, though. We want them to understand what this means. So you could, again, use those place value charts. I will show you some manipulative sites that I will add into the Learning Coach newsletter, and you can also watch videos on how to do this, because we want students to understand that when you add numbers, you definitely want to line up the place values. So let me get a sheet of paper and I'll give you a few examples. Okay, when we look at that very first one, we have 33 and 72 hundredths plus 28 and 8 tenths. It's very important that we teach students that we have to always line up the tenths, the hundredths, the ones, the tens. So they can always fill in a 0 when there is not a digit there, because that 0 does not change the value. So when we add, we can add as usual. We have 2 hundredths plus 0 to get 2. Now we have 7 plus 8. Well, that would be 15 tenths. I know that I can regroup. If I have 15 tenths, that means I have a whole and 5 tenths. So I can bring that whole over here, and now I can add again. I have 4 plus 8 would be 12. I have 12 ones. That would be 2 ones, and I'd take that extra 10 and move it over here. So I'm regrouping. We always want to talk about regrouping, not just carrying this over. And we don't want to call this a 1. It's a group of 10. It's one group of 10. This is one whole. So now we have 4, 5, 6. So our answer would be 62 and 52 hundredths. Now again, the same applies even when you add multiple numbers. Always encourage students to line up the place values. Right here, there is not a decimal, but we need to teach them that a decimal could appear right there after the 89, because it won't change the value. It's 89 wholes regardless whether the decimal is there or not, and we want to line it up according to the value of the digits. Now when we start subtracting, students begin to have a little bit more difficulty, because when the decimals especially don't line up exactly, or they don't have the same number of digits. So let me turn on the webcam again, and let's take this first example: 98 and 4 tenths take away 23 and 65 hundredths. Again, we need to fill in any empty spot with a 0. Always, tell students one of the best things to do is go ahead and add that decimal down all the way. I think of it as a stop sign. It has the 3 dots. We got to keep that going. And again, we are not borrowing, because if you borrow something, you give it back. we are going to regroup because I cannot take 5 away from 0. So I'm going to get a group of 10 from over here. I'm going to turn this one into 3 groups of 10, and I'm going to bring that group of 10 here. So now I have 10 take away 5 is 5. And again, I'm not just going to go borrow 1. I'm going to go regroup, and I'm going to take an entire 10. So I have 13, or I took an entire 1 actually because I was taking it from the 1. So I just visualize this 1, and remember I could turn that into 10 little pieces. So that's what I did. I turned it into 10 tenths. So now I have 13 take away 6 is 7. Now we have 7 ones, take a 3. 3 ones is 4, and 9 tens take away 2 tens is 7. So my answer would be 74 and 75 tenths. So encouraging students to make sure they really understand the value and how place value works and how regrouping works is the key to success with this unit. You will continue to have problem solving, and so students will need to know whether they need to add or subtract. There could be even multi-step problems. And then we do want students to estimate, which basically is the same as rounding, but it may not always tell you where to round. This one does. It says round each number to the nearest hundredth and then estimate the sum. So if we rounded those to the nearest hundredth, let me turn my webcam on again. So let's see, we have 450 and 303 thousandths plus 120 and 661 thousandths. If I rounded to the nearest hundredth, I would round to this digit right here. So I'd have 450 and 30 hundredths plus 120 and 66 hundredths. And then I would add as usual. Now sometimes you may have things that say, just looking at the whole number, say this is about 500, this is about 100, so we have about 600. So it depends on how the question is asked and how specific they are with their directions. Now we're getting near the end of this unit. There are some core focus because we do definitely, as we talked about here, we definitely, and this is what you're going to see in Study Island, understanding how the value changes from place to place. So the 2 in the tens place is how many times the value of the 2 in the hundreds place. And I showed you that with the magnets, just like this. So build numbers and definitely compare the values. And like I said, this is going to be in Study Island, and that is one of the key critical components of this unit. And then I'm going to also share with you what the extended response items look like for this unit. It does talk about ordering the decimals from greatest to smallest. And the thing that's great about this too, it says here's the decimal, so we want it to be or from greatest to least, but it says equivalent decimal. And again, we want students to understand that sometimes decimals may look a little different but really be the same thing. Like here we have 5 and 20 hundredths, but that's the same thing as 5 and 2 tenths. So they need to go on the same row. And there's some others that are just like that. Again, we're going to order the decimals. It's important for students to really think about, does it say least to greatest or greatest to least? And they want you to use the symbol because we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller each time, so they use the greater than symbol. And then we have that number line, and it says place a dot on the number line to show the order of each decimal. So you really need to think about, just like I did with those models, and again you could color in the centimeter grid paper to help with this and have them place that on the number line. Here is analyzing student work and really thinking about the mistake that students make, and I think this is excellent, and this is part of the standards and what your child could see on the end of the year assessment. They don't want you to just get an answer. They want you to understand the math and be able to analyze other students' work and critique and argue your reasoning. So definitely look through those. And then we are going to estimate and think about those rounding techniques and what's the nearest inch. So that's a fun activity. But this one is definitely an extended response that is very applicable to the standards. And here we have what we just talked about as well, comparing the values of the digits. And students need to understand that 1/10 is the same as dividing by 10. We've broken it up and taking a tenth of that, or we've made it 10 times bigger. And it talks about, do you agree, disagree, or and explain your reasoning. So again, I'm going to show you where to find all of these resources. So if we go back to the OLS, the lesson guide, this is the Learning Coach lesson guide. If you go to the resource section and then go to decimal addition and subtraction, you're going to see the extended problem solving. You're going to see the centimeter grid paper that you can cut out and color, and you're going to also see decimal place value charts, so you can compare digits just like we did. And remember, a deck of cards or making number cards is a great learning tool. Do not forget that there's always LearnZillion. If you haven't created a free account, definitely do that. When you create a free account, go to that Common Core Navigator tab. And if your child is struggling with basic addition and subtraction, definitely go back to 4th grade and look at some of those resources. You can then click on 5th grade and learn more about decimals. When you hover over, this is still talking about understanding the place value system. You can hover over any of these and it will tell you what that standard is. And then you can click on any of these folders to review lessons. Right here it says perform operations with multi-digit whole numbers and decimals. Right down at the bottom is division, I believe. Let me see. No, it's add, subtract, multiply, and divide decimals. So this is one that you'll definitely want to check out, this MBT7. There's 2 different folders with different sets of videos. They're going to provide that conceptual understanding to help your child, especially if you don't have some of the manipulatives or don't have the ability to create some of these on your own. And most importantly, don't forget about the 5th grade math web page. There are 2 different pages that are going to help you with this decimal unit. Numbers and operations in base 10 has a lot about the place value and decimals with the visuals. There's links to games. There's some charts you can print out. And again, lots and lots of activities and links to videos. Now, when you go to the next page, it's the computation. That's going to give you resources about adding decimals and subtracting decimals. And then later, we will get into the multiplying and dividing decimals. But our Class Connect sessions before we get to that are going to be talking about multiplying whole numbers and dividing whole numbers before we ever get to that. And when you scroll down on this page at the very bottom, you will see more things about the decimals, but you definitely want to master these 2 skills before. A lot of these lessons were not thoroughly covered in the 5th grade OLS. There was some of this in the 4th grade OLS. So it's okay to use some of your optional days in the OLS to spend time going to Class Connects, even if you can't mark something off. We definitely want students to be strong mathematicians that make sense of the math instead of just completing the math just to have it done. Again, we have skipped to Unit 5 because we feel like it will help with the transition of learning. After we do decimal addition and subtraction, we're going to go to decimal multiplication and division. And then we're going to go back in and do these fraction activities. And then we'll head into geometry and things like that. Now, we may also skip some of these semester reviews, especially if we are moving things around in the curriculum. So if you notice that a teacher skips something for you, don't worry. They did it for a reason. And we are wanting math to make sense to you and your student. Thank you for listening and have a great day. I accidentally said bye too early because I did want to talk to you about math in the real world, especially with whole numbers and decimals. We can find decimals everywhere, from clothing stores to music stores to electronics and sports. So definitely, as your child is looking through magazines or as you're at the grocery store or ordering from a menu, talk about those decimals, compare the values. Also, give your child an amount of money and say, okay, if you have $100, how much could you buy? What would your wish list be? How much change would you get back? What's more expensive? Which items in the electronics store, especially if the digits are very similar, and comparing those and have them round to the nearest tenth or the nearest whole dollar. So have fun exploring decimals in the real world, and we'll see you next time.